bienvenidos a esta conferencia organizada por la Maestría en Economía Aplicada y el Doctorado en Estudios y el Departamento de Estudios Económicos. El ponente del día de hoy es el doctor Craig McIntosh de UCSD y moderará la sesión de Tiare. Entonces, bueno, le cedo la palabra a Tiare para que proceda.
Hola, buenos días. Me permitiré a continuación leer una breve semblanza sobre el ponente. Dr. Craig McIntosh, doctor y maestro en Economía Agrícola y de Recursos por la Universidad de California, Berkeley, y licenciado en Economía por la Universidad de California, Santa Cruz. Es profesor de Economía en la School of Global Policy and Strategy de la Universidad de California, San Diego, y codirector del Laboratorio de Diseño y Evaluación de Políticas de la misma universidad. Es un economista del desarrollo cuyo trabajo se centra en la evaluación de programas públicos. Ha realizado evaluaciones de campo de políticas innovadoras contra la pobreza en América Latina y África, en países como México, Guatemala, Malawi, Ruanda, Uganda y Tanzania. Ha publicado numerosos artículos en revistas de alto prestigio como Quarterly Journal of Economics, Review of Economics and Statistics, Economic Journal y Journal of Development Economics, entre muchas otras. Los más tradicionales de políticas de asistencia social. Es un experto en temas relacionados con el crédito, seguros y ahorro en los países en desarrollo, así como en temas relacionados con cómo diseñar y realizar experimentos controlados de manera aleatoria y las técnicas de medición en campo necesarias para identificar los resultados. Bienvenido, doctor, y le cedo la palabra.
Muchísimas gracias por esta introducción muy amable. Mi español no es muy fuerte, por eso puedo presentar en inglés, pero si hay cualquier pregunta, voy a tratar de manejarlos en español. Thank you very much for the invitation to present today. I am an old friend of Colef. I've been working with Tito and Gerardo for many, many years. We worked together on the evaluation of the Habitat program, which Colef did a really remarkable job of managing. I think it's really a study to be proud of. So it's nice to be back and see some old friends again. So thank you very much for the chance. So what I want to present today is a project that in a way is almost more like, I think the most interesting thing about the project really is the idea in terms of asking what is it that we're trying to achieve in development, and then from the perspective of a high-level donor like USAID, how is it that they can most cost-effectively deliver the kinds of outcomes that they want to see, right? These outcomes are not controversial at all. So what we're going to be talking about today is child malnutrition in one of the poorer countries in the world, Rwanda, a very densely populated country, tiny farm sizes, obviously a country coming out of a history of very, very severe conflict, lots of malnutrition among children, lots of stunting and wasting, and then a somewhat ruthless but very efficient government that is trying to kind of understand how to bring down these child malnutrition rates. So USAID, like most big development organizations, feels very confident that it knows how to do these things, and it tends to build very elaborate, complex programs that have lots of different dimensions. So it's like the planning process for these things. It's like a ball that everything sticks to as it moves through the planning process. So, there's the people who like to do behavior change, and there's the people who like to do nutrition, and there's people who believe in savings, and that, right? So as these programs move through USAID, they tend to just basically acquire pieces of every single kind of programming that anyone related to the program thinks might work. And then what you end up with are these very complicated, very multi-dimensional programs, which in and of itself may be a good idea, but along with that complexity comes a lot of cost, a lot of overhead, right? So if I'm running a program that has 6 different subcomponents, I'm usually subcontracting each one of those components to a different organization, and each organization has its own staff and its own overhead and its own offices and its own vehicles, and all of that is money that's getting burned off along the way and is never actually arriving at the ground for the beneficiaries, right? So it's a well-known secret, if you can call it that something like between 50 and 70% of most of these large, complicated programs is spent on overhead in one form or another, and it may be overhead of the initial large subcontractor to USAID, who will usually be a big Washington-based firm of some kind, and then they subcontract, and their subcontractors subcontract. So all of these things are eating up costs, right? So there's nothing wrong with complexity, and of course, like we all know, poverty is a complicated phenomenon, and it may be that you need a very complicated program to resolve some of these problems. But then all the way at the other extreme, there's this different way of thinking about things, which is to say the big new technological change that has really swept through most of Africa over the course of the last few years is access to mobile money. So 90% of households, even in rural Africa, in most of East Africa now have access to at least a phone in the household. And these are not smartphones, right? These are 2G dumb phones, the old Nokia garage door opener telephone. But the companies there, the telecoms companies, have been very intelligent about building really sophisticated products that work over very simple telephones. So the mobile money has now become kind of the primary way that anyone sends remittances within the countries. Almost all billing now is moving over, for any services that are provided are moving over to paying by mobile money. And so the telephone has quickly kind of taken on the role that the credit card plays in more developed countries. So what this means is that you suddenly, for all of history, basically, it has been incredibly difficult and expensive to reach rural African households, which is where most of the malnutrition lies. There's been no alternative but to spend an enormous amount of money and burn a lot of gas to get out to those households in order to try to do something like help the malnutrition of their children. And now suddenly you have this incredibly straightforward, inexpensive conduit to go straight into that household, which is just send them the money directly by mobile money. And the transfer fees are on the order of 0.5%. Even if you set up a big NGO to run these things, you're still only going to have overhead rates of, let's say, around 7%. So this research is basically motivated by kind of these two bookends, right? On the one side, you have these very complex, expensive, multidimensional projects. And on the other hand, you have this incredibly cheap and straightforward thing, which is to say, hey, where does this malnutrition come from at the end of the day? People are poor. And if I want to try to decrease that poverty, the most effective way to do it is to get as much money to them as possible. And clearly mobile money is the way to do that, okay? So what these projects, I'm going to present the first of them, and we just have the results from the second one, which I'm not supposed to talk about yet, but I'll mention them briefly at the end. They look very similar to this. So what we did was we set up these projects to be a kind of a cruel test in a way. It's a very aggressive form of research at some level because it is a horse race from the perspective of USAID. Here is $1 leaving USAID's hand to go straight through mobile money as cheaply as possible and get right to the household. Or here is this very complex project where lots of money will be eaten up in overheads as you go. So in other words, they're not built to be cost equivalent from the recipient's perspective. They're built to be cost equivalent from the donor's perspective. And that means that in fact, the recipients are getting a lot more money out of the cash transfer, okay? So this is the idea, these benchmarking projects. And so clearly, this is a fairly threatening agenda in a certain way. It's kind of asking, like, does the whole development industry make sense? Or would it be better off to just think of a kind of an oportunidades for the world? This is clearly an area where Mexico has been the global pioneer. I know you're changing course now, and maybe that's a natural progression as a country moves through being a middle income country, that you start with programs of this kind and then move away from them. So certainly no one has to tell a Mexican audience about what cash transfer programs look like. But these are purely unconditional here, okay? So there's no kids being required to go to school or checkups having to be made. So literally the households are just being given the money, no strings attached, okay? So this is a kind of program that is becoming more popular, but has not been, as I understand, used in any large-scale way in Latin America. In Latin America, in general, cash transfer programs have always come with strong conditions. And I think the reason for that is that Latin America has paid for its own cash transfer programs. And I think that there's a deal between the rich and the poor that basically the rich believe the poor are misbehaving and they want to use a cash transfer program as a way of trying to control the behavior of the poor. So the only way that you can pass a tax-financed cash transfer program is to make it conditional. This is a different environment because these are cash transfer programs that are not tax-financed, they're donor-financed. And so then in some sense, the donor just wants the answer to the question, what's the cheapest way to achieve the end that we want? And it's important to remember, conditions are expensive, right? It takes a lot of time and energy to be out tracking attendance and et cetera, and maybe you should just give it away. So we're not comparing here conditional and unconditional, but just to kind of put it in the context of Mexico's experience. And I'll say this is joint work with my colleague, Andrew Zeitlin, who is at Georgetown. So just a quick motivating idea. Bill Gates had the idea, look, if there's so much malnutrition in Africa, why don't we just give every single African household a chicken per child? And then those chickens will be laying eggs, and if I eat that one egg a day, that is actually a sufficient amount of protein to stop stunting for most kids in most contexts. So then the question becomes, well, how difficult is it to actually deliver a living chicken that is ready to lay eggs to every single household? It seems like a simple idea. I worked in Somalia on a program that tried to deliver chickens, and it is anything but simple to keep chickens alive. So just as a way of kind of saying, like, these ideas appear very appealing, and the idea of giving someone in kind seems attractive. There's something, wow, that egg, that's hearty and it's nutritious. And just giving money to people, again, we tend to believe that people will misbehave if they're given money with no strings attached. And so I think that the thing that's important to remember here, again, is this is an extremely poor country. So poor households in Rwanda are not poor because they made some mistakes or they've wasted money or they have, drug addiction problems or something along these lines. They're poor because everybody's poor. Everyone in these villages is poor, right? So there's a sense in which you have like very stable families, good parents. You see what I'm saying? The social conditions are in place. This is a stable cultural environment. They're just extremely poor. There's an article that my colleague Paul Niehaus wrote in Foreign Affairs, which is trying to make the argument that we should start thinking about cash transfers as being like index funds, right? So in the investment industry, it's been very difficult for people to tell, am I beating the market or not, because you're paying all of these fees to people who actively manage money. And the thing that has risen up and kind of swept the board in the finance industry is index funds, right? They're neutrally managed. You just buy an index of the market. They're very cheap. And then that gives you a clear benchmark that you can think about the returns of any other portfolio against. So the idea here is, it's not necessarily to say that cash transfers are always going to be the best thing to do. It's that there is a sense in which they are kind of a natural index fund for development, that if I'm going to claim that I have a program that works well, like, why does it make any sense to say I spent $50 million and I did better than nothing, and therefore this was an attractive program, right? At some level, if you're trying to think about what would be a natural hurdle to try to beat, you might want to say, I should show you that I can do better for the beneficiaries of this program than they would do if I just gave them the cost of the program. And that's basically what we're setting up here, okay? Then I think the final point about cash transfers, which is to me in a way the most important point, is, the development world is full of paternalism, right? And it's full of people who believe they know best what other people should do in their lives. And so one very clear benefit of giving unconditional cash is that it tells you what the poor want themselves, right? If I simply relax a credit constraint, what do they use the money on? And once you've revealed that clearly, once you've seen clearly this is what a poor household does if you make them less poor, now you've got a different question to try to solve, which is, again, I need to now justify why it makes sense to try to force them to do something other than the thing that they would choose to do themselves, right? As economists, we should believe in revealed preference. And there are going to be arguments where you do want to try to force them to do something else. But now let's make those arguments explicit and crisp, right? That's kind of the point here. So why might we want to give programs in kind? There are very good reasons. One of them would be market failures, right? So for example, let's imagine that all of the dairy cattle in the local market are of very low quality and they are very poor producers. It could make sense to try to run a one cow per family program where you're bringing in much higher quality dairy cows that you can't procure in the local market, right? Prices may be wrong. Externalities, internalities, right? For example, households that, I think one of the core points underlying Progresa and Oportunidades was supposed to be that society cares about the long-term education of these children more than very poor households do. So there's a legitimate argument there that there's a disconnect between the priorities of the poor and the priorities of society. And so a conditional cash transfer is effectively trying to shift prices to get poor people to do what society wants them to do, right? So that argument can be made, but we're trying to argue that you really need that, you need to make it quite crisply, okay? So then what are some established outcomes from the literature? So basically lots and lots of new evidence showing that cash transfers work, right? This is probably the most studied intervention in development now because it's so easy to randomize. It's the easiest thing to randomize. So there's just a massive number of randomized controlled trials looking at cash transfers. Lots of evidence that they improve consumption, they improve asset investment, and then also improve much deeper set of outcomes. For example, we ran a study in Malawi showing that they actually work to combat HIV/AIDS, and that having adolescent girls have additional income in their pockets helps to allow them to resist pressure from men that would otherwise be causing them to get HIV, things along these lines. So very broad set of outcomes improved by cash transfers in poor countries, and incredibly little evidence that that money gets wasted. Lots of people have gone looking for the, are you drinking it, are you gambling it, are you using it on drugs, and just virtually no evidence from any study that this actually happens, okay? So it's an important thing to recognize. Again, like these are functional households who seem to use resources well. Then as you move more into in-kind programs, you can look at things like the Targeting the Ultra Poor program by BRAC, which I think right now is maybe the program that has the best evidence base behind it in terms of really transformational impacts that last a long time, years and years and years, really seem to be able to take a poor household and kind of kick them onto a different trajectory. But those programs are very expensive and they involve a lot of hand-holding, and you have social workers visiting your house every week for 2 years. And right, so again, it's a very complicated program where a lot of money is spent on things that are not direct benefits. So, and by the way, please feel free to interrupt me. I'm an economist, so I get nervous if I talk for too long without being interrupted. So to try to get at this, so what we did was we built a three-armed, fundamentally it's a three-armed randomized controlled trial. So you have one arm that is a control and gets nothing. You have one arm that is the USAID arm, and it gets this big, complicated package of anti-child malnutrition interventions, and the very similar package to things that USAID does all over Africa. Okay, so they have a virtually identical programs in 7 or 8 other African countries. And then we have the cash transfer arm. And those are coming from Give Directly, which is a nonprofit run by my colleague Paul. And so then the design is basically randomized at the village level. We have 248 villages in the study. And then we have a few kind of methodological advancements here, because one of the problems is if you're going to do this kind of cost equivalent comparison, you have to know what the program actually costs. And you don't usually have any way of knowing what the program costs until it's been implemented, right? Because until it's been implemented, all you have is a bunch of grant proposal budgets, which we all know are not what actually happens, right? So how do you get the cost equivalent number right when you don't know the number? And this is the problem that has messed up a lot of studies where people have set out to try to do something like this, they get the number wrong, and then it's very difficult to interpret. So what we did was we took a range, and we said we're very confident that the cost of the program will fall within this range, and then we randomized the transfer amount over that range. And so then what we can do after the fact is now control for the cost in a way that I'll show you. We're basically putting a linearization of the impacts over cost, And then that allows us to use the ex post number that we got from the costing when the program was over and nail the exact cost equivalent amount subject to this linearization. And then the other, there's a few more tweaks which I may not have time to talk about, but we also have an arm that gave a much larger cash transfer. So at the end of the day, this program was not very expensive, okay? So the cost per household, because they spread it out over so many households, so the cost per household ended up being about $120 per household. So the cash transfer organization that we were working with said, we don't think we help people with $120. We think we have to put more like $600, and then we really see changes. So we had another arm which isn't cost comparable, is a much larger transfer, and so then the question is what happens there. So in a way you can think of this as two different kinds of benchmarking. One of them is benchmarking across intervention, and the other one is benchmarking across scale, right? Because if I now have a group of people who are getting 5 times as much money, that opens up the question, is the impact 5 times as high? And if the impact is more than 5 times as high, then that suggests that by concentrating more money on fewer people, I get a higher total benefit. And if the impact is less than 5 times as high, then that suggests that I should be spreading the money out across more people, right? So you can think of it as like benchmarking across modality and then also benchmarking across scale as what these two things do, okay? Okay, so the program that we're benchmarking against is called Vikuriro. That means a well-growing child in Kinyarwanda, which is the language of Rwanda. The 4 primary components, I would say some of which make a lot of sense and some of which don't. So they have this village nutritional school. So the idea there is basically like micronutrient deficiencies may not be well understood by parents, right? These people, like most very poor people in the world, tend to eat a very starch-heavy diet. Where something like 80% of your calories are coming from one starch. And they have farms on which they could be growing greens and other things that are rich in micronutrients, but that's often not done. So the combination of the Village Nutritional School is basically trying to teach, particularly the mothers in households, how to, without spending more money, how to buy a diet that is going to be healthier for their kids. The Farmer Field Learning School is kind of like agricultural extension. At the end of the day, basically all of these folks are farmers. And so the idea is if farmers are going to eat better, it's going to have to come off of their own land in some way. And so they're teaching them how to grow these micronutrient-rich foods, and then they're also giving small grants of seeds and tools and things like that. Then this piece, maybe you think makes sense and maybe doesn't. The idea is like if I'm dynamically trying to fight poverty, if I'm helping somebody up and then the next shock they get hit by, they're back up against the wall again, I haven't done anything. So they're trying to build up savings institutions with the idea that if these households can build up a little pool of savings, then that helps protect them against the next shock and it doesn't show up, in their kids. And then finally, there's this thing which is like pretty standard, what is referred to as a WASH program in the development world, so water, sanitation, hygiene. So it's how do you keep your water clean? How do you keep your hands clean? How do you cook in a household where the water that the household is using is not safe, so as to avoid having the kids get sick from it, right? So this is a very standard behavior change intervention that's done in lots of places. There are a couple of studies from adjacent countries showing that much more expensive programs that were spending more like $800 per household, were effective in decreasing child malnutrition. And so this program is kind of a cheaper variant, and what we're going to show you is that it was totally ineffective. Okay, it did absolutely nothing to help the children at all. So here's the ex post cost per beneficiary. The money leaving USAID's hand, $141. The cash transfers are given via mobile money, as I said. There was a additional randomization that we did to try to understand lump sum versus flow transfers. So there's kind of a conventional wisdom that if you're trying to protect nutrition, it's better to give people money a month at a time. And that matches the consumption flow that you think you want the kids to be benefiting from. And again, very similar in a way that if you think the poor are misbehaving and wasting money, you don't want to give them a big chunk of money because you feel they're going to run off and waste it. And so in a way we can think about these flow transfers as almost being like moving towards an in-kind transfer. I'm trying to kind of control you in a paternalistic sense and affect the way that you spend the money by giving it to you in a manner that matches the way that I want you to spend it, which is gradually to be buying more food for the kids. Okay? So we have an additional experiment there that I may have time to talk about. So, oops. Okay, so this is the research design. So 74 villages in the control, 74 villages in the Gikuriro. This is the USAID program arm. And then the Give Directly villages are split across these different transfer amounts. So here's the range that we thought the program would fall in. So these are what we're calling like the cost equivalent transfers. Here's the bigger transfer, okay? And then really the biggest headache of this whole study was this. It's hard enough to do any randomized control trial because you have to agree on what does eligible mean in a way that can be observed in the same way in a control group and a treatment group, right? So eligible is always obvious in the treatment group. It's whoever got the program, right? So then the question is, how do I go into villages that didn't get the program and in exactly the same way identify just the same type of household, right? So this is always difficult to do even with one implementer. And with two implementers, it becomes much more difficult. So we argued about this on the phone 2 hours a week for about 6 months before we started the study. Finally came to a definition of eligibility that I'll show you. And the key to this is that this had to be observable before the study started. And so we had all kinds of mistargeting that we knew was going to happen, and we knew also that the Gikuriro was going to end up treating some of these households that we called ineligible. So if we were very confident about that definition of eligibility, of course we wouldn't have surveyed ineligible people. It's a waste of money. But because we were pretty sure there was going to be mistargeting, we wanted to get both types of households. So we know how many of the different kinds of households there are. And so we're able to both estimate impacts on the kinds of households that we agreed beforehand should be eligible. And then using survey weights, we can then also upweight the ineligibles and now estimate impacts on the whole village, on the average person in the village, okay? So that was kind of our safety policy from a design perspective. We knew beforehand that the targeting could end up being a complete mess. And we didn't want to end up with a study where they were differently targeted and therefore you couldn't interpret our results. So this was how we tried to deal with it. Okay, let me just skip this because I don't think I'm going to have a lot of time to talk about it. So here's the eligibility. So Rwanda is a very bureaucratic place. The government has categorized every single household into these 4 poverty categories they call ubudehe. So we took all households in the poorest 2 categories who have children, plus any household that was in that category that had a pregnant or lactating mother, plus any household that had a child who was recognized as malnourished by the government healthcare system, even if that household wasn't poor according to the criteria, right? So the definition of eligibility was completely focused on kids. It was all about finding the households that are likely to have vulnerable kids in them, okay? So this is another thing that we just spent unbelievable amount of time arguing about before we started. And I will just say as a methodological matter, you're aware that these so-called pre-analysis plans are now becoming much more common in experiments, right? And so normally the idea behind a pre-analysis plan is you're trying to make it so that you're taking away your ability to go fishing for results after the fact. So you've said very clearly, this is what I'm claiming I'm going to affect. In this study, because it was so political and so controversial and there was so much fighting the whole time, the pre-analysis plan took on a different role, which was basically like once everyone had agreed to it, we have not deviated from that pre-analysis plan ever in the slightest way because it kind of took away the argument. We had the fight at the beginning before anybody knew what the results were. We fought out all of these issues, and then now we're just doing everything exactly the way that we said we would do it. So consumption per capita, you can see who wanted this, right? This was the cash transfer people wanted that as an outcome, right? And then these child growth and anemia, those were the outcomes that the health program wanted. And then dietary diversity was something that they both actually had in their causal chain, right? So the cash transfer people really said, hey, we're not trying to affect these. And the child nutrition people said, we're really not trying to affect that. So this was like a compromise, right? You see it's a kind of a 2.5 outcomes sort of for each of the implementers that were the things that they cared about. And then a whole bunch of secondary outcomes: savings, debt, fertility, disease burden, mortality. Those are kind of common. Specific to Guerrero, sanitation practices and health knowledge, right? Because they have this behavior change component. So you really want to go measure the actual behaviors that they're trying to change. And then health-seeking behavior and preventative care. And then the Give Directly cared a lot about the housing quality, because a lot of the evidence on big lump sum cash transfers show that the main thing that people do with this is improve their house, and specifically put on a nice roof. Okay, Rwanda has made it illegal to have a grass roof, so there are no grass roof houses in Rwanda. So that's the thing that most people have found, and we couldn't find that, but we were looking for other things. Okay, so just very quickly then, what the way that we're going to do the simple analysis. This is just a normal experimental analysis. So this is what's called these days an ANCOVA. So you have the outcome variable from the end line, and then you control for the outcome variable from the baseline, right? This is kind of David Mackenzie's suggestion to us. This is like a difference in difference, except a difference in difference would impose rho equals 1. You have a set of covariates that we also pre-specified, and then we just simply have dummy variables for the Guerrero treatment, the cost equivalent Give Directly, and the large transfers, right? So this is a very normal way of analyzing a 3-armed experiment. Then to try to do the cost equivalence piece, we're doing something more complicated. So there, what we're doing is let this G bar be the cost that we estimate for the study, and then define tau as being the difference between what a specific cash transfer arm got and the cost of the other program. So it's the surplus or deficit relative to the cost of the other program. So then the idea is that you put in, it's the same regression. You're now putting in this cost number. So this thing is now like a slope term, which is measuring kind of like how much does another $100 get you. And then because this is defined relative to the cost of the other program, when we put these in here, this now means that this is estimating the cost of Give Directly at the exact cost equivalent amount, right? Because that's 0, it's become the intercept in this regression. And then this is estimating the differential impact of the in-kind program from that exact cost equivalent number, okay? So it's a way of dealing with the fact that we didn't know the right number when we started the study. It exploits the randomization of this TC, and it comes at a cost, and the cost is that we're basically assuming or imposing that the response to money is linear, right? And if it's not linear, then this is misspecified, okay? So it's not really in the spirit of experimental analysis, right? People don't usually like to put any functional form on the way that they analyze experiments, but because in this case there's this very specific concern about getting the cost equivalence right, and because the randomization that we're using of the transfer amounts is right around the cost of the other program, we hope that linearization is not too strong an assumption, okay? So then what can we estimate? So we can estimate the intention to treat, which is the normal experimental analysis. You just ignore non-compliance, right? You ignore people who don't comply. Now, of course, everybody complies with cash transfers, right? No one refuses money. We did have a few people who felt that there was something religiously wrong about accepting free money. So we actually did have a few people who refused unconditional transfers. So that's the normal experimental analysis. This total causal effect then is also using the ineligibles and weighting them up so that you're now estimating the representative effect on the average person in the village. And then this is the cost equivalent regression adjusted number. Okay, so those are kind of the 3 ways that we'll try to do this. So this chart I think is actually kind of interesting. So this is basically showing, so first of all, this is the after the fact cost to US aid. Okay, so this is like the dollar leaving USAID's hands. Now this, I think these numbers are really quite interesting in and of themselves. So we went over, we had a forensic accountant come in and cost everything that was done in the program. And so this is, I think, a very, very reliable number. So it's basically saying 51% of the money that USAID put through Gikoriro ever arrived in the village in any form. Okay, this is not saying that the beneficiaries got it as value, because this would include, for example, if you sat in a training, you received the full value of that training, right? So it's not to say that this was like money in hand. So if you did money in hand, this number would be more like 90% of it is overhead. Okay, so 51%, even being very generous about what we considered like the beneficiaries received this money, more than half of the money was burned up in overhead. Okay, and then what you're seeing here is that because we costed the cash transfer as if they were running a national program of the same scale. And so basically the idea there is that because so many of their costs are fixed, right? You have to set up an office, you have to hire employees, that if you're giving small amounts of money, you still actually end up with quite a high overhead for cash transfers, and that you only get down to those very low overheads that Give Directly advertises for its programs in Kenya and other places if you give a lot of money, and therefore you amortize those fixed costs better, right? So then this is the money received by the beneficiaries, and then this is the cost to USAID per eligible household, okay? So I actually think it would be better if every development program kind of had to present numbers that look something like that, right? I think we probably don't have enough conversations about that dimension of spending. Okay, so balance, it's balanced. Attrition is fine, except for the kids. We had to, if you guys have ever done these kinds of surveys, it's difficult to, anthropometrics mean you actually have to go find every kid again, because we're trying to do panel measures. We measure the same kid twice. That's difficult to do in rural Africa. It's hard to get out and get that same kid again. So we did have some differential attrition. And interestingly, Gikoriro, which is supposed to be doing all of this stuff, I'm sorry, these are so small, actually did a better job of keeping track of those kids. Okay, so like we were I think it's okay, no?
They are listening online.
Oh, then okay, sorry. So we did a better job of finding the kids in the Gikoriro villages, which means that program did actually do a good job of identifying and keeping track of these malnourished kids. So then moving now to impacts. So these are the primary household outcomes. So we look at Gikoriro, we see absolutely no impact. If anything, a slight decrease in both consumption and wealth. Some improvement in dietary diversity, right? It's getting close to being statistically significant, but it isn't. Then when we look at the cost equivalent cash transfers, okay, generally cost equivalent, then we're also seeing that they didn't achieve any of the primary outcomes either, right? And sort of every cash transfer study that's ever been done with large amounts of money shows changes in consumption. So basically what you're seeing here is the amount of money was not large enough to move this, right? And that's what happens when you study cash. What do people spend cash on? They spend it on all kinds of things, right? So you get this slight increase in all kinds of things, and you have to have a lot of money or a huge sample to be able to detect them. So once we move from the small transfers to the large transfers, then now we're able to pick up significant effects there. And again, remembering that this is about 5 times as much money as that, in general, you're seeing impacts that look pretty linear, right? It is as if there's just this kind of linear scaling up in consumption. Okay, secondary outcomes. So the only outcome anywhere in the entire study that the USAID program moved is savings. Okay, so the only thing that they managed to achieve, the only component of their programming that was effective was these savings groups really did generate savings. Now, however, if you look at the cash transfers, if you give people an equivalent amount of money, they don't save it. What do they do with it? They pay down debt. And in these areas, the interest rate on savings is 4 or 5%. The interest rate on credit is 35%. So in fact, it is much more rational if you have additional liquidity. It is much more rational to decrease debt. And also, I should mention, 40% of households have both debt and savings at baseline. So it in fact makes much more sense to pay down debt than it does to save. And so you can see here it's almost like a financial version of in-kind, right? If I drag you to a savings group, I can induce you to save. And yet if I just relax your liquidity constraint, what you do with it is not save it, you use it to pay down debt. Now here, even the small cash transfers are showing some effect on productive and consumption assets. So these are kinds of the core things that cash transfers tend to move in other studies. So we're basically just able to detect them with those small transfers. And then the big transfers, again, we're seeing effects that look about 4 or 5 times as big, generally suggesting that you have a pretty linear effect of giving people more cash. Okay, now moving to the individual primary outcomes. So these are the outcomes: height for age, weight for age. MUAC, the mid-upper arm circumference, is generally considered to be the best biometric indicator of severe malnutrition. Okay, so kids who are really horribly malnourished are very skinny here. Height for age is more sensitive to improvements in nutrition a little bit further up the distribution, and MUAC is the one that is really sensitive to severe malnutrition. And then we did anemia testing for the kids, and we also did anemia testing for the moms. Okay, so we never got any effects on anemia anywhere in the study. Brutal. I mean, this is really a brutal result, right? That the core things that this program was meant to do, it did not do. It was never effective at improving the child health outcomes. And the only intervention that we have that did move these is the large transfers. Okay. Now, these have stars on them, but they're small numbers, right? These are in standard deviation, so it's about a 0.1 standard deviation improvement in the child anthropometrics. So most nutrition experts that I know would not think that spending $600 to get a 0.1 standard deviation improvement in this is necessarily a highly cost-effective use of this money, but it is the case that cash moved it and the in-kind program did not. Okay, so then these are just fan regressions that are basically looking at the treatment effect by the age of the kid, and it's just basically showing that we don't really see any effect for kids who are already born at the time the program started, and what really seems to be happening is it's the kids who were in utero at the time the program began who are the ones that had the biggest effect. Okay, so this is an environment where you have almost universal breastfeeding. The government has pushed very hard to get mothers to breastfeed, and as you know, the mother's body will basically hijack itself to give that nutrition to the children, and so it basically indicates that breastfeeding is working well enough that additional consumption in the household didn't actually improve those kids, and what it really took was it was the in utero kids whose health was improved, and a similar thing when we look at anemia, that we did actually have significant improvements in anemia for the youngest kids who were exposed the earliest in utero, but that then once we had any child who had been born by the time the study started, we don't see any effects. Okay. This is just an attrition correction. Okay, so then, and then these are the ITTs on the secondary outcomes. Really nothing much here on any of these broader health outcomes, depressingly, right? So again, Gikaruro was directly targeting child mortality, live births in facilities, disease burden, diarrheal prevalence. This is where I should really see the impact of all of the WASH piece showing up. And absolutely nothing there. Okay, so really just the program was totally ineffective on all health outcomes. The cash didn't really do anything either, with the exception of this, which is potentially very exciting, but as you know, when you have very rare outcomes, you can get statistical significance from tiny, tiny changes. So, I'm not sure how seriously you want to take this, but it does actually look like there was a slight decrease in child mortality off of this very, very low mean. I mean, I guess it's not so low for 13 months to have 1.3% of these children die is not so low. So, but from a low baseline, we detect something there. Okay. So then moving to the cost equivalent comparisons, you can kind of already tell what all of these are going to look like from the rest of the answers, right? So we know we're going to have big slope effects of additional money on the outcomes where the large transfers did much more than the small transfers, right? So here for consumption, dietary diversity, this is showing you basically what's the additional punch that you get for an extra $100. And then because cash is spent on consumption and Gikoriro didn't improve it, then we are actually seeing that Gikoriro did significantly worse at improving consumption, but not their dietary diversity. Looking, this is the secondary outcomes. So again, we already saw that there was this big increase in savings in Gikoriro that was not there in the cash arm. So you're seeing it significantly better at inducing savings, but cash is significantly better at decreasing debt, right? So that's, again, kind of, you already saw these results. It's just kind of changing the way that we present them. And then all of these asset measures that are the things that people spend cash on are moving much less from Gikoriro than they are from the cash transfer, okay? And then when we do it for the primary outcomes, it's we are seeing the slope effect on cash for height for age, but again, those effects are so small, and Gikoriro did also move them slightly that we now don't have a significant difference when we do the cost equivalent comparison, okay? All right, let me skip that. So then these now just quickly are looking at let me just see, how much time do I have? How much of this do I want to skip? I'll wrap up fairly quickly. Okay, so let me just talk through fairly quickly. So we pick up very little at the village level. One good result, I think this is maybe the only good result that really looks like what they expected to see, is that when you step up and you look at the whole village population, in fact, Gikoriro was able to improve health knowledge. So it's kind of an interesting thing that it's saying the households that they meant to reach didn't learn anything from their programs, and then the households that they didn't mean to reach did. So maybe saying something about like capacity to learn and how that correlates with poverty. That may be what we're seeing here. And then let me just jump forward. Okay, so lump sum versus flow, we see very little. And if anything, the only places where we see significant differences, the lump sum transfers are always better. Okay, so there's absolutely no evidence here, even looking directly at the kinds of child consumption metrics that people always say flow should be good for. There's absolutely no evidence that that's the case. And generally, we've just beat this thing up every way we can. We took a behavioral economics lens to it. We spent a ton of time looking at how this correlates with time inconsistency and self-control problems and other control problems, and trying to find kind of like the malady that flow payments are better for. We just can't find any evidence whatsoever. So effectively, at the end of the day, the takeaway is that this is a very functional population. People are using this money very well, and you don't change how they use it at all by taking it and giving it to them in a flow rather than in a lump sum. So the main takeaway from all of that is going to be, effectively, just like we're showing that cash in general is working better than these expensive programs, we're also showing that the cheapest form of cash, which is just give it all to them at once and let them decide what they want to do with it, is certainly no worse, and if anything, maybe slightly better than these more expensive and paternalistic programs that are giving cash over the course of time. Okay? Let me skip this. Even finding that if we gave people the ability to choose whether they wanted lump sum or flow, and we even find that assigning them to the wrong one has no effect. So in the Heckman terms of like essential heterogeneity, do the beneficiaries understand their own heterogeneity? There's absolutely no evidence of essential heterogeneity either. They don't know better than we do which of those is going to benefit them. Okay, so again, emphasizing that these lump sum transfers seem to work very, very well. Spillovers, kind of the only place that we're seeing negative effects of the cash are here. So these don't have stars on them, I'm sorry. But basically, we are seeing some evidence that in the give directly large villages, there's a decrease in dietary diversity, there's a decrease in wealth, there's a decrease in savings. So there are a bunch of effects that are consistent with the idea that when you get this surge of cash into these very poor villages, it drives up prices. And that when those prices get driven up, that then people whose income remains the same are now pushed deeper into poverty by that increase in prices around them, okay? So you may have seen last week, there was this big general equilibrium study from Kenya that gave vastly more money than this. It was like, they gave like 18% of local GDP through a cash transfer program, and they found positive spillover effects. So it's, the implication seems to be if you give enough money to actually really start driving the macroeconomy, then everybody benefits. And we didn't do that. And so what we did was we drove up prices without making the macroeconomy better, and therefore the spillovers are negative instead. So I'll wrap up then. So basically this is kind of a new way of trying to think about comparative cost effectiveness. We did all the hard work up front, which means that then the comparison between the programs on the back end is very simple and transparent. This program that we benchmarked against really didn't work. So in the end, it's not that interesting a case. It would have been a much more interesting exercise if we had two programs that were both effective and generated different profiles of impacts. And in the end, we basically have cash that did something versus a USAID program that was almost totally ineffective, with the exception of savings. So in a sense, you didn't really need the cash arm to tell you that the other program didn't work, because it just didn't work even in a simple RCT sense. So then, like I said before, this kind of try to kind of think about policy trade-offs in these three dimensions. So across programs, that's what the study is built to do. Across scales, these comparison between large and small cash transfers let you think that way. Across outcomes, it's going to be very unlikely that any program will be better across every outcome. And so kind of where we see this agenda going, ideally, would be that you would have a sense of, across a lot of different programs, these are how different combinations of programs move different combinations of outcomes. And it would allow policymakers to be more intentional about saying, this is the kind of benefit that we care most about generating. And then you would be able to tell them basically, like, this is the combination of programs that will do that most cost effectively. And then the last thing that we're working on right now is across individuals. And so what we're doing is using a bunch of the machine learning tools that Susan Athey has been working on to try to get the individual level impacts of the difference between in cash and in kind, to try to understand, are there certain types of people who actually benefit more from the in-kind program than the cash program? And if so, can we describe those types? And then that may allow policymakers to think about this from a targeting perspective, right? That maybe you actually want to come with both kinds of programs and just make different decisions about which kinds of programs you're giving to which kinds of people. Okay? So let me leave it there. Thank you.
A continuación se llevará a cabo una sesión de preguntas con el doctor con referencia al tema que nos vino a presentar. Si alguien quiere participar, por favor, levante la mano. Adelante, doctor.
Professor, first of all, congratulations on the presentation, and welcome again to Colef.
Thank you very much.
It's great to see you again. And I have a question about STDs. I know that Rwanda is in the middle of Africa, and there's a lot of large percentage of the population has STDs, and that has an effect on mothers giving their babies breastfeeding or other things. Does that have an impact on the results that you have? Because I see that only large transfers, some of your programs have really a significant impact.
That's right. So, yeah.
And the other one is, I don't know if you care about R squares or T stats or your F stats. They're at the, I don't know, I saw that probably less than 50% of them are significant. Is that important in your study, or only that certain variables are significant?
Yeah.
And thank you again. Welcome.
Thank you for the welcome, and thank you for the questions. So taking the second one first, I mean, in an RCT where you're studying programs that don't work, you will have a low R squared, right? So there's like almost this one-to-one mapping between how effective the program is and what your R squared will be. Now we are using here, we pre-committed, maybe this is a little bit innovative, we pre-committed in our pre-analysis plan to use a post-lasso machine learning algorithm to pick the covariates out of a pre-specified group that have the highest R squared on predicting the outcome in the control. Okay, so we don't use the treatment groups at all. We use the lasso model to select the best covariates, and then we control for those now, including the treatment arms and the treatment dummies. So given that, we should have a higher R squared than other studies because we're using this kind of optimized set of covariates, but as you've rightly seen, they're not very good. And that has potentially something to do with data quality, and I think a lot to do with the fact that in general the programs we're studying didn't work very well. So among the randomistas, it's not very, R squared is not the criterion that randomistas use, right? It's about, is the program significant or not? On the STD front, I'm very interested in that question, and I've been working for years in Malawi on this project that is looking at cash transfers and HIV. Nobody really wanted to talk about that here. USA didn't want us measuring it, the Rwandan government didn't want us measuring it, and there was a general sense, so I kind of pushed early on, could we go in this direction? And it was like, no. Once you've opened that box that you're going in and asking like the mother of the household questions like that, you've totally changed the point of what this study means, and it was not something that anyone was interested in. I think it's too bad because I agree with you, it's an interesting question. The Malawi study that we did that found very big effects of unconditional cash transfers on HIV, I think, is a special cultural context where in Southern Africa, different than Eastern and Central Africa, there is this more entrenched cultural tradition of what people refer to as transactional sex. And so like money and sexual activity get linked together in a way that is very dangerous and unfortunate for adolescent girls, especially poor adolescent girls. So I think we found these very strong effects in Malawi of those programs. Other people have looked for those effects in other contexts that don't have that cultural tradition, and my understanding is that no one has really found effects that look like that. So my personal view, and I'm stepping a bit past the experiment here, is that really, whether money works to drive that outcome has everything to do with, is money mixed up in the question of sexual activity in the first place or not? And I think it's fair to say that there are cultural contexts where it is, and there are cultural contexts where it isn't.
Adelante con Norte.
Hi, Mr. Craig, thank you for coming. And also I have a question related to, first you mentioned that comparing large versus small transfers, the large could be the winner because of the cost savings. However, I'm curious on understanding, just comparing the small with the Gikuriko program, would be better to assess all transfer into the Gurico, or maybe just concentrate on the small transfers, even though you will be taking account the paternalistic way of giving the money. And also, if you took any consideration on education or human capital on these villages into account for this investigation.
Okay, thank you. So that really is the key question, right? Because showing that these huge cash transfers worked, I mean, that in a way, the media on this study when we came out with it was like cash wins. Mm-hmm. And that really is an incorrect interpretation of the results, because cash wins when you give 5 times as much cash. That's not so surprising. So it's a bit depressing. I'm not happy to be saying it, but I think the real interpretation is the fact that both Gikuriro and that smaller amount of cash, neither one of them worked. Mm-hmm. And so really at the end of the day, I think maybe the takeaway is that if you want to improve child malnutrition, you have to spend real money on it. And that neither one of these inexpensive programs could deliver it. And the fact that 2 programs that are so different and take such different causal theories to how to decrease child malnutrition could do it at $140 a household. Mm-hmm. And also the fact that there are programs like Gikuriro that spent $800 per household in other countries and were proven to be effective, right? That I think in a sense the real takeaway there is like you can't get this outcome for cheap. If you want to achieve it, you have to spend more. Now, I'll say one small thing. CRS and USAID were very unhappy with this study for obvious reasons, and pushed back on us very hard, and they said, well, look, this is only a 13-month study. And so it was a stupid study in the first place because you didn't give enough time for our wonderful program to work, even though we fought at the beginning to keep the control group open longer and they refused, right? So that point is certainly fair. And it's entirely possible that if we had continued to study these households for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, maybe something wonderful would have appeared. But I think the pushback that we've had on that is that these programs are almost always targeted at specific malnourished kids. Right? It's not that I'm generally saying like I'm gonna just give this to everyone in the hope that it gets some kids. You're going out and you're saying these households currently have malnourished kids and we're going to target them. So what we know from so much recent literature is the importance of like this first 1,000 days. That if you haven't addressed the insults of poverty to a child by the first 1,000 days, you'll never overcome them, right? You cannot recover from what's happened to you by the end of your second year. So I think that does put a different light on this, which says if you're going to have programs that are targeting specific malnourished kids, you have to help them fast. Yes. And it doesn't really make sense to say, oh, well, they'll be better off in 4 years, because if you get improvements in HAS between age 3 and age 4, those don't translate into improvements in cognition or anything else, right? So at the end of the day, any program that is targeting a specific set of malnourished kids, time is of the essence, and you have to figure out how to move those things fast. So it's not a perfect answer to your question, but at the end of the day, I think the main takeaway really is that the cheap programs don't work.
I'm going to make a question in Spanish.
Por favor.
Estaba pensando en el proceso de implementación. Si USAID tiene este subcontrato con ADIN ahí en la región, es muy probable que dé un buen servicio, por ejemplo, de salud o de nutrición, etcétera, ¿no? O educación para la salud. Me preguntaba si el menos del 50% que llega finalmente al lugar, ¿no? Si se subcontrata instituciones, ese, aunque sea menos del 50%, cada dólar gastado ahí compra el mismo nivel de servicio que compraría el dólar que se le da a la familia directamente. Porque a la familia que se le da directamente tiene que salir al pueblo a buscar el servicio. Es muy probable que el nivel de servicio que encuentre de un proveedor privado o público incluso sea de menor nivel que el que provee USAID directamente con subcontratistas. Entonces, ¿cómo se controla este efecto de implementación en tus resultados?
Ya. Es una pregunta muy importante. Pero es pregunta distinta, ¿no? que nuestra, porque nuestra pregunta es la pregunta de USAID. Si gastamos $1 aquí o $1 aquí, ¿qué es la diferencia? Su pregunta es como la pregunta de los hogares, sus mismos hogares, ¿no? Si recibamos $1 en esta forma o otra forma. Simplemente no tenemos esta comparación en nuestro estudio, ¿no? Porque tenemos que ampliar los gastos como 2 veces, porque reciben una mitad con dinero comprado a efectivo, ¿no? Es como tenemos que doble los impactos de dinero si queremos compararlo a perspectiva de los ingresos. Estoy en completa en acuerdo con usted que la calidad es bajo. Ampliando esta calidad es muy importante de servicios de prenatal y postnatal, pero eso es una obra de años, ¿no? Es muy difícil hacer su pregunta es importante, pero fundamentalmente es distinta, ¿no? Es una pregunta distinta que esta investigación es fundamentalmente por perspectiva de USAID.
Sí. Craig,
En México estamos viviendo, digamos, una situación, digamos, de una transformación más o menos importante en cómo se venía, digamos, aplicando mucho de la política, digamos, asistencialista del gobierno mexicano, ¿no? Pasamos, digamos, de la aplicación de programas complejos, como por ejemplo el Prospera, ¿no? El POP, ¿no? Que venía desde el 1997, a un programa, por ejemplo, de becas, ¿no? De becas para estudiantes de preparatoria, o hay otros ejemplos, ¿no? Pero sí se ha transferido mucho, digamos, de la aplicación a través de programas a la entrega directa, ¿no? De recursos. Estamos de alguna manera, algunos ansiosos de ver los resultados del próximo año, ¿no? Con el censo de población y con las aplicaciones de las mediciones de pobreza, para ver cómo se comportó, digamos, este cambio, porque ya va a tener, digamos, de alguna manera se va a ver reflejado en los resultados del próximo año, ¿no? Porque ya tenemos los del 2018, si bien es cierto el POP no había demostrado, digamos, una eficacia muy clara, al menos sí se había detectado un efecto de contención, ¿no? En el sentido de que había evitado que en alguna medida los efectos, digamos, de los problemas económicos o de la situación económica que vivía el país no se vieran tan afectados, digamos, en el aumento de la pobreza, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, estamos en una situación también económica no muy favorable en este año, y probablemente el próximo año tampoco sea muy favorable. Entonces, bueno, no sé, ¿cuál sería tu interpretación o cuál sería una hipótesis a comprobar en este sentido, un poco retomando tus resultados?
Okay, if you don't mind, I'll answer in English because it's a complicated question. Okay, so a few maybe not very well related things that I think, in my opinion, bear on the question. So one of them is that I think that the more a program moves into an in-kind form, so for example, improving the quality of healthcare services, I think that citizens, again, like when you're in a circumstance that you're talking about programs that are taxpayer financed, like Mexico, citizens have an expectation that they should be getting those services from the government. And I'm not sure that there's a very strong patronage reward to politicians from delivering those services, because it's just simply public goods that people expect politicians to deliver. And my suspicion is that as you move those programs into delivering more private goods, they are much more effective politically, because there's more of a psychology that I've received something directly from the government and that they are populist successes from a political perspective. So my suspicion is that there is always a pressure for politicians to move in that direction, because I think that they are rewarded for moving in that direction, whereas providing basic services in kind, I think, is harder to get the returns from at the ballot box. You don't feel that you've personally received a benefit from the government in quite the same way. So that would be one. The second thing, I was just yesterday at one of my PhD students is studying the effect of one of Bush's tax refunds. So after the financial crisis in the U.S., Bush basically just gave every household in the U.S. something like an average of $900 cash and said, go spend it. We have to get the economy moving. And so he had scanner data from stores, so he could really measure exactly what people spent the money on. And there's a huge increase in the consumption of alcohol. There's a huge increase in the consumption of sugar. The consumption of, literally the quantity of sugar in people's diets doubles for the month after they get that cash transfer. So my sense is that the wealthier the country is, the more likely it is that unconditional cash gets misspent. And I think it's hard to understand, like, for how poor the people in this study are, right? I mean, really, I don't think you can find any part of Mexico that you will go to and you will find people who are just really up against hunger every day in the way that the kinds of people in this study are still. it's hard to overstate how extraordinary this experience is in their lives, right? Like they're getting twice the average annual income of a working adult in one payment. This will never happen to them again. And the way that money is used and the care and the thought that they put into it, I think is just very different from the way that people in richer countries think about additional cash. And then I also think this is not a very politically correct thing to say, but I think it is probably true that as you move into richer countries, being poor is more highly correlated with individual dysfunction in some way. And if poverty is correlated with individual dysfunction, then giving people cash is a bad idea. So my personal sense is that I think this is a set of results, that this picture that seems to be emerging from these studies, and I'll say, by the way, we also just finished the second one of these studies, which was a youth employment program, spending about $400 per kid. They were taking underemployed youth, and almost exactly the same set of results. This big, very complicated, multidimensional USAID program has absolutely no effect on employment, and the cash just lights up every form of consumption that we look at all the way across the board. It lights up emotional health, well-being, self-efficacy, like all of these psychological things improve. So my personal take at this moment in time is that these kinds of results are really localized to very, very poor countries. And I think that as you move into richer and richer countries, this kind of just unconditional return of money makes less and less sense. That's my personal take on it. So I would consider Mexico to be a very wealthy country compared to the places I normally work. I'm more skeptical about the wisdom of this kind of program in such a country.
¿Alguien más? No?
I thought those welfare payments since the 80s that you couldn't spend in alcohol.
This was just a tax rebate.
Oh, the tax.
So WIC and CHIP, the like food stamp types of programs, those you cannot. But there's also a lot of research showing that for almost all households that are beneficiaries of those programs, the transfers are inframarginal, meaning that they're getting less than they would have spent on food anyway. And economic theory tells us that as long as those transfers are inframarginal, people will always have the opportunity to just take cash away from the food that they would have been spending and use it on whatever they want. So the ability to control behavior with inframarginal in-kind transfers should be very weak. And it should only really start to manifest itself as meaningful if you're transferring so much that you're actually giving people more than they would have freely chosen to buy otherwise. So I think almost all the literature on food stamps in the US says it's all inframarginal, and therefore, even though there is a lot of effort putting into controlling people's consumption, it kind of can't be effective at some bigger level. Yeah.
What we're seeing is they're cutting in the US those welfare programs, like the EBT program.
That's right.
That,
That was just announced a couple days ago. They're going to try to push almost 1 million people off of food stamps in the US. Yep. But that's now an aggregate income effect, right? Like stepping away from the conversation about are you managing to control the specific things they're spending the money on, that's a huge reduction in income for some of the most vulnerable households in the US. So, yeah.
Okay. Yes, a couple of quick questions. Regarding the design of the RCT, you mentioned that randomization was done across villages.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering what's the logic of doing it across villages and not across households? And the second is the money within the household, does it matter who gets it?
Okay. Those are both very good questions. So the household randomization, the village randomization, really, it came from two things. So first of all, we were concerned about spillovers. There's pretty big evidence base now that you do get spillover effects from the cash transfers, and so if the controls are living right next door to the treatments, then that can really mess up an RCT and give you the wrong answer altogether. So you step up at a level, you don't have as many problems with spillovers, but now you lose statistical power, right? Because it's at the cluster level. The more important thing really was that the Gikoriro program is a village program. They're dealing with village health officials and village trainings. And so lots of components of what they do just logistically are fundamentally done at the village level. So they said from the very beginning, our very first conversation, we're not even entering into a conversation about having some people in a village get it and some people not. Either we work in a village with everyone or we don't work there. So they basically shut that off from the very beginning. And so the study was big enough that it was okay. It was still adequately powered. And then the second question, the simple answer is we don't know because we didn't randomize it. Again, in the Malawi work that we did previously, which was very focused on adolescent girls, we did randomize how much of the money went directly to the girl versus how much went to the parents. And there are other studies that have randomized father versus mother. And those studies also don't tend to find very much. It doesn't matter that much. So I guess at some level, my takeaway, like as development economists, we love to think that everyone is crazy and husbands and wives are fighting and people suffer from all these self-control problems and there's all of this kind of interesting perversity going on all the time. And really the result of a lot of these cash transfer studies is like that doesn't really seem to be the case, and that basically no matter who you give the money to, the household gets better off in the same way. Whether you give it lump sum, whether you give it flow, you get the same thing. So I don't mean to oversimplify. There are studies that find some distinctions, but there's this huge literature on intra-household allocation with a lot of empirically not very well identified results showing that it matters a lot. And then you go run these cash transfer experiments and you tend to find that it doesn't matter very much. So in general, I mean, I'm more and more inclined to say, again, like in these environments where you're dealing with functional poor households, the unitary household model and the Homo economicus model of decision making seem like they're actually pretty accurate. So yeah.
¿Alguien más? ¿No? Ok, se agradece a todos la presencia de la conferencia de hoy. Para concluir, se hará entrega a nuestro ponente invitado de una constancia por su distinguida participación este día. Y la voy a leer. El Colegio de la Frontera Norte otorga la presente constancia al Dr. Craig McIntosh por su participación como ponente de la conferencia Evaluación comparativa de un programa de nutrición infantil contra transferencias de dinero, evidencia experimental de Ruanda. Firma el Dr. Pedro Paulo Raca Romano, coordinador de la maestría en Economía Aplicada, y el Dr. Jorge Eduardo Mendoza Cota, director del Departamento de Estudios Económicos.
Muchísimas gracias.
Con esto damos por concluidas las actividades del día de hoy. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a todos y todas. It is an interesting